some facts about the late Archaic period in Michigan, and some about a late Archaic period site that I found under an abandoned house that was torn down. I will not give locations of that, only that it is in Saginaw, Michigan. But the three Archaic periods, early, middle, and late, lasted from 8,000 to 500 BC. Now, I've looked for information on the Archaic periods here in Michigan, but there is not much information available due to the fact that there does not seem to have been a great occupation in Michigan during those time periods. But because of this, I will consider information from neighboring states and in Canada, but in particular Ontario, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Illinois. The Archaic period people were hunters and gatherers. They moved to where the food was and didn't set down roots, so to say, or to speak. This changed with the coming of the woodland periods when pottery made its appearance on the scene. This one advancement helped to bring real change. Now it would be possible to store food for future use. The Archaic people depended on hunting, fishing, and collecting a wide variety of plant foods. It is now believed that late Archaic people may have domesticated squash around 2300 BC. By this time, people were becoming increasingly efficient in their adaptation to various environments, especially in the Ohio area, and I would assume the same to be true here in Michigan also. Archaic Native American Indians did establish campsites, but they were not permanent settlements. They moved to where the food resources were. Because I'm only getting to see a small sampling of relics from my site, which I've named the CC site, after my cat, Charlie Cat, it's difficult to tell much about the people who inhabited the site and the entire neighborhood there as a whole, because I'm only looking at one little portion of a city block. Other hard stones were used, and some very soft stone. I have found the remains of 2 arrowheads made of shale, and as soft as shale is, I cannot fathom that these were used for hunting. I have found a number, well, because they would shatter if they hit anything, but also, it occurs to me that perhaps they were training points, training boys to make arrowheads. They could have also been toy pieces, but I really doubt that. They just, I don't know. But anyways, they were very soft material, and they're not in the best of shape after, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, or maybe over 1,000 years in the ground. Shale tends to deteriorate, and that's what's happened with these. But they are on display in the collection that I have assembled. I wonder, too, if they might have been of some ceremonial use, but they usually made the best and saved the best for ceremonies and burials and so on. But anyways, I'd like to quote from an excellent work by Jill Arnold, which gives us a look at what Michigan was like in the Archaic periods. The early Archaic in Michigan was from 8,000 to 6,000 BC, she wrote. During this period, water levels of the Great Lakes were much lower than they are today. Many sites where the late Archaic people lived are now underwater, and that's made it hard for archaeologists to study the early Archaic periods in Michigan. We do know that the climate was quite likely warmer than it is today. Miss Arnold went on to explain that mammoths and mastodons began to disappear, but other game animals came in, such as deer, and took their place in the food chain. I would add here that years ago now, my dear friend who has since passed, Jerry Wagner, him and I had the chance to look at a mammoth kill site near Tawas, Michigan. The remains and some stone tools were dredged when a pond was being built. It is out Old 23, almost to, I forget what road splits off from it now there, but that's where the site is anyways, or was. Miss Arnold's paper describes the Middle Archaic period, but says nothing about the late Archaic. While it is dangerous to ever assume anything, I am thinking that the late Archaic was similar to the Middle Archaic. She wrote the following: with the changing environment, Middle Archaic people between 6000 and 3000 BC looked for new ways to make use of their environment. They created new tools, new technology that helped them gather food and make things that they needed for everyday life. I'm going to stop again from quoting her and just say, just a moment to say that at this site, the CC site, they would seem to have been experimenting with various stones, as truly there's a wide variety of stones present that have been crafted, well, not beautifully, but have been crafted into usable pieces. And but now let's get back to her report. She continued, during the Middle Archaic times, people began to make new kinds of tools. I think I just said that, for working wood. They ground and polished hard stones, like granite, to make chisels and gouges. Those tools, along with the adze, were very likely used to make useful objects such as wooden bowls and dugout canoes. At my site, the CC site, as I have named this one in Saginaw, I have found many tools which would have been used in woodworking. These included celts, adze, small spoke-shaped type stone knives. I have little doubt that these people were proficient at tool production. I found a lot of fragmentary bones, which at first I mistakenly felt was refuse thrown out from a Victorian-era kitchen. But as I began taking a closer look at these fragments, they appear quite ancient. A number have cut marks on them, and a few appear to have been worked on in an effort to make perhaps bone tools, which would not be uncommon. One specimen is honed to a very sharp point, and it has a small flute on the side where the arrow shaft would have attached and could easily be recognized as a bone arrowhead for hunting. I want to continue, though, again with more details about my CC site, but first I want to read one more paragraph from Miss Arnold's fascinating article. She wrote, "The first people entered the area that we call Michigan over 10,000 years ago. They hunted and fished for thousands of years, and despite the hunting and fishing, the environment showed little impact from their lives here. When the Europeans arrived, around 1620, woodland peoples of the Algonquin language lived on this land." So let's talk a little bit about effigies, as I found one so far at this site. This effigy, if it were unbroken, would be in the shape of an arrowhead. It has a hole drilled, and that is where the piece broke. Well, what is its purpose? I can only guess, but I would believe it would have been, in a way, like a good luck charm. This might have been for luck in the hunt. It was probably thought to have mystical power, and likely would have been a prized possession of its owner, who also probably made the piece. When broken, its power was gone, and was likely discarded and laid there for over 1,000 years till I picked it up the other day. That's kind of cool to think about, really. That under our feet where we're walking, and, you expect it in Europe and in the old world. But people don't think about that so much here in the States. Walking the streets of Saginaw or wherever, there is history lying beneath, which is pretty cool. Anyways. In my assemblage from this particular site, I have found 5 stones notched and sharpened in the notch, and I believe these would have been worked much in the manner that a spoke shave would work. Again, to learn more about late archaic life in Michigan, we need to take a look at a nearby area, in this case, Ontario, Canada. The Ontario Archaeological Society published an interesting report which would tend to suggest what life would have been like in Michigan in the late Archaic, just across the water. An author is not credited, however, I will be quoting from that source. During the Archaic periods, native peoples evolved their way of life to adapt to a temperate forest environment in a landscape crisscrossed with lakes, streams, and rivers, and surrounded by large freshwater lakes. Small hunting and gathering bands of 20 to 50 people utilized the lake shores during the spring and summer months. They likely, when winter arrived, broke into family groups and moved inland for the fall and winter. Food would have been plentiful during the warm months of the year. The lakes and rivers are teeming with many species of fish, aquatic birds, and mammals. Nuts, berries, and edible roots could be found in the forest and marshes. The fall would have been a busy time because foodstuffs would have to be stored and clothing made ready for the winter. And during the winter, people moved inland to hunt and trap food and furs. We don't know exactly what archaic houses looked like, but from the size of most sites, probably the people probably lived in an oval wigwam-like structure made of frame poles and covered with bark slabs or reed mats. This type of house was easy to build or move and could be heated with a small fire near the entrance of the structure. There might have been pits within the houses for storage of food and other items, and that also is the kind of house, if you will, that the woodland Indians lived in when the first Europeans came here and spoiled the neighborhood, so to speak. Continuing, though, the late Archaic period ran from 4,500 to 2,900 years ago. Human activity in southern Ontario appears to increase significantly during the latter portions of the Archaic period. Archaeologists have recognized at least 3 distinct traditions within a 1,500-year time period. These are referred to as narrow point, broad point, and small point. The narrow point tradition is defined largely on the presence of narrow-bladed stem projectile points, often made from coarser-grained raw material such as quartzite. Other tools associated with this tradition include flake scrapers, graving spurs, spoke shaves, and wedges. I might interrupt here and say all of which I have found on this site. Sites from the narrow point tradition appear to have been the most common in New York State and further to the southeast, but a few have been found in the Niagara Peninsula region and as far west as Guelph. These sites seem to have been especially common along the shores of a lake known as Lake Wainfleet in the Niagara Peninsula area and Lake Tonawanda in western New York. This lake would have drained when Niagara Falls had eroded a high topographic contour about 3,900 years ago. It is suggested that this group overlapped with the Laurentian Archaic, which might explain the lack of narrow point sites in eastern Ontario. Points characteristic of this tradition, however, have been recovered from the Armstrong site on Wolfe Island and in the St. Lawrence River. The broad point tradition is defined on the basis of a large, broad-bladed stem point, which makes an abrupt appearance in the sequence of cultural development, but probably developed from similar forms found in eastern New York, where soapstone vessels appear for the first time. In Ontario, these points are generally made from Onondaga chert, but greywack was also commonly employed in southwestern Ontario. A very distinct red quartzite has been used in the production of these points in the Rideau Lakes area. The large size of these points has led to the suggestion that they were not used as projectile points, but rather as knives. Ground stone tools are less common in this period. The small point tradition is characterized by a reduction in point size that may suggest the introduction of the bow and arrow. Although differences in point styles are difficult to distinguish within this tradition, a number of point types have been recognized based primarily on sites from southwestern Ontario. Much is known of this period on the basis of excavations around Hamilton and Brantford near Lake St. Clair and along the eastern shore of Lake Huron. One site excavated in the Hamilton area produced possible evidence of housing structures. This site had either two 4x4 meter houses placed adjacent to each other, or a single 8x4 meter structure with the greatest intensity of occupation located at the end. Although no sites relating to the period have been systematically excavated in eastern Ontario, small point archaic sites and multi-component sites within small point archaic material have been reported in the region. These include 2 burial sites in the Kingston area, Collins Bay, and the York site near the community of Verona, and a burial near Picton, Prince Edward County. Sites with small point archaic materials have also been identified in the Ottawa Valley near Arnprior. Among the more significant developments to occur near the end of the Archaic period is the elaboration of burial complexes, including what is referred to as the glacial cave burial complex. Sites relating to this complex have been found throughout southern Ontario. Representative sites include the burials at the York site and Picton in eastern Ontario, the Hind site southwest of London, and the Port Franks site on the eastern shore of Lake Huron. Burials consist of both cremations and extended individuals with inclusion of grave goods. These materials consisted of a variety of items, including slate gorgets, paired copper adzes, sandal, sole, and circular marine shell gorgets, and birdstones with protuberant eyes. Galena, believed to have been obtained in the Ottawa Valley, Mississippi Valley, has been identified on southwestern Ontario sites. The increase in exotic materials and the increased attention paid to burials heralds a trend which is to continue until the middle woodland, and appears to be at least inspired by similar phenomena to the south, specifically from the Ohio and Mississippi River regions. Some researchers suggest this rise in behavior extraneous to simple food procurement and survival may be due to the increased efficiency in food collecting, which allows greater amounts of time to be devoted to other more social and symbolic activities. The establishment of specific cemetery areas certainly indicates greater group identification with specific geographic areas, possibly tribal territories. The presence of exotic and therefore relatively expensive artifacts with some burials suggests that some individuals had achieved greater status in their life, but that there is no evidence as yet to that this status was inherited. I might add here that on Van Etten Creek in Oscoda, Michigan, an early woodland or late archaic burial site was found and excavated by the state in part, and it's known as the Brant burial site. These were red ochre sites with, as this indicated, there was at least one cremation burial there, and the other burials, including cremation, were all lined with red ochre mineral. And not far from there, years ago now, I found the place where the red ochre was likely worked on for the burials at the Brant site, and that was actually published in the Michigan Archaeologist. And if you check out my playlists on Michigan and Michigan Native Americans, you'll find that story in there. If I remember, I'll try to put a link to it at the when I get done with this video. Data from the burials suggest that band sizes range between 35 to 50 persons, with considerable freedom of movement for individuals between bands. Population would meet in these numbers at sites located near larger lakes and rivers, presumably where food was most abundant, such as when fish were spawning. Limited evidence from southwestern Ontario indicates that these groups would have dispersed in the winter and resided in more secluded locations, probably in order to hunt more dispersed animals such as deer. Archaeologists have attempted to trace ethnicity and language to at least the late Archaic period, with considerable variation in opinion. Two language groups are recognized to have been occupied Ontario at the time of the first European contact: Algonquin and Iroquois. One contention is that the Iroquois language, and what ultimately became recognized as Iroquois culture, resulted from in situ development in southern Ontario from the Laurentian Archaic. Others have suggested that the small point tradition represents the first appearance of Iroquoian-speaking populations migrating from farther south. Yet another interpretation is that the Algonquin language developed from Western influences from Paleo-Indian times and until at least the Point Peninsula tradition, a middle woodland period in southwest Ontario, when the Iroquois intruded as the Princess Point culture. That's all the information I have right now on the late Archaic. It's a fascinating and mysterious time period for me. Everything that I've worked with in sites previously for the past 30 years has been late woodland and middle woodland, and they had been large occupation sites by water. But anyways, if I come up with more information, I will be sure and revise this video. Thanks for taking a listen. Please leave your comments below, as I enjoy hearing from each and every one of you. God bless, and have a great day.